Can I open now this 100% renewable UK webinar on the subject of 100% renewables and SMRs, which has been organized in the wake of a terrible piece of political lobbying and domination by the nuclear industry, who of course have captured the British government for a long time, about the last 70 years, really. But it has been particularly pernicious recently in the Environmental Audit Committee of the House of Commons, where they organised a terribly one-sided hearing on small modular reactors, which suggested to us in 100% renewable UK to organise this seminar, calling on the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee to have a hearing about the feasibility of 100% renewable energy, which we regard as being eminently feasible, but of course we're open to ideas on the subject, as opposed to SMRs, which are, as we know, technological and political fantasy. And our speakers are going to talk about these themes. I think Mark Jacobson will head off in a couple of minutes, but for talking about these, particularly 100% renewables, but also a few comments about small modular reactors. But I am going to start off by giving a little bit of a policy introduction, and I'll run through this quickly as I can. That sort of title expresses what I'm talking about quite neatly. And just to stress that we need urgent decarbonisation of the heating system. We can have 100% renewables on the electricity, but in order to turn it into 100% renewables for all of energy, we need the heating. And of course, in California, you'll be more used to, of course, air cooling systems run through electricity. They usually are there, of course, but we want heat pumps there, well, because they're much more energy efficient than current systems. And as you see, Canada and the US actually feature in the heat pump stakes as far as installations per 100,000 population are being roughly in the middle. Of course, terrible UK is next to Hungary. We won't say too much about Hungary. They've got a sort of cozy relationship with guy called Putin in Russia for natural gas, so maybe there's some excuse for them, or not, as the case may be. But of course, no excuse for the UK and their terrible record on heat pumps. But isn't it significant that the coldest countries have most heat pumps, like Norway, Finland, and Sweden? Therefore, so we ought to get to them quickly. And I actually talk about this just by coincidence. I happen to talk about mention my book, which is coming out in May, Energy Revolutions, Profiteering versus Democracy. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. And next, nuclear is getting priority in the UK. Sizewell C, which Alison is going to be talking about, is getting shed loads, billions, tens of billions of pounds of subsidies from the energy consumers. Meanwhile, the oil and gas people are making massive profits, incredible eye-watering sums, more than most small countries make in a year. And they've been doing this year after year after year, about £3 billion a day every year. It's amazing. But as you see, you can see the chart about how renewable energy is going way ahead of nuclear power in today's world generation, and how if you had this continuation of the last 10 years of trends about how renewable energy would fulfill all total world energy within by 2050 on current trends, but it's only if they have the right policies, which we don't have in the UK. As you see, they banned onshore wind and onshore solar, and even offshore wind isn't going ahead as quickly as it should be. And meanwhile, their energy efficiency policies have been incredible. They virtually closed down the insulation energy efficiency policies not doing much about heat pumps either. But we've done some work modeling 100% renewable energy with the help of LUT University, who did a comparison between what 100% renewable energy would cost compared to what the government's alleged policies towards net zero would cost. And we found that 100% renewable energy would do it much more cheaply, and also that you would get much lower carbon emissions as a result, as you see from this graph, much cheaply as well. That's some of the energy shares, and you can see some shares of fuels used in renewable energy. You see no nuclear, but mainly solar, with lots of offshore wind in the UK, some wave power if it develops, otherwise offshore wind, and that will do the trick. There's some promising developments in tidal stream and so on, and maybe some geothermal as well. And there's more about this in my book, which I'm shamelessly promoting. If I don't, who else will? But this is a quote here from an American activist, Paul Gipe. I'm sure Mark Jacobson has heard of Paul Gipe, who said yes. Toke boldly goes further, calling for a revolution. Who gets to develop and own our own renewable future? He takes on the axis of evil, Reagan Thatcherism and their destructive cult of neoliberalism. Well, there we are. I'll stop my stuff there, but we'll carry on now with the main speaker of today, the best known anyway, which is of course David Toke. No, it's Mark Jacobson, Professor Mark Jacobson. Right, I will hand over to you, and if you would like to share your screen, I'm sure you can do it much better than I have just done it. And
well, thank you, David. So no, actually, I'm not going to share I don't have anything to share. I'm going to just talk about this issue to give you some numbers. So I've been working on transitioning energy infrastructures for countries and states for I don't know, 15 years now, and looking at climate and air pollution problems and their solutions to them for about 35 years. And in that process, we've actually developed an energy plan for the UK. And so I want to first posit that it is possible to transition the UK to entirely 100% clean renewable energy and storage for all energy purposes at much lower cost, while creating many more jobs than are lost, while using minimal land, while keeping the grid stable, while eliminating air pollution problems in the UK and eliminating climate problems, or climate-related emissions. And so let me just start by giving you some numbers. So, first of all, I look at it from not only a climate point of view, but an air pollution and an energy security point of view. And when you look at it from all 3 points of view, you find very clearly that a transition to clean renewable energy is the best way for any country or region or continent even. And in the case of the UK, I mean, there are about 15,000 deaths per year from air pollution. And based on statistical cost of life and morbidity and other impacts, this is about a cost of $140 billion per year to the UK as a social cost, on top of the estimated climate costs in 2050 in the UK would be another about $250 billion per year. So we're talking, we have a huge social cost on top of that. It's a huge social cost on top of the energy cost, which is another $230 billion per year in 2050. So the total social cost is over $600 billion a year if we do not transition our energy infrastructure. If we transition to clean renewable energy, we eliminate the health costs, we eliminate those deaths and all the millions of illnesses associated with the deaths, and that $140 billion a year cost associated with it. We eliminate the emissions associated with climate change and the corresponding costs of that, and we reduce our energy costs substantially. So let me talk about that for a second. So with fossil fuels and bioenergy, when we have combustion, we're wasting a lot of energy because of the loss of energy in the heat that's resulting from the combustion. And if we actually electrify all energy and provide the electricity with clean renewable energy, in the case of the UK, our energy requirements go down about 60%. That's for 5 reasons. One is the efficiency of electric vehicles, electric transportation over internal combustion engine vehicles, the efficiency of electrifying industry over combustion industry for high temperature processes, the efficiency of electric heat pumps over gas and oil and wood-based heating, combustion heating, ending the energy used to mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels and uranium. Worldwide, that's about 11% of all energy is used just to mine, transport, and refine fuels. And then end-use energy efficiency improvements beyond business as usual. When we add all of those up, that's about, for the UK, that's about a 60% reduction in energy requirements simply by cleaning up our energy system. And that means the cost per unit, well, on top of that, that's even if the cost per unit energy is the same in a clean renewable energy system versus a conventional system, you have 60% lower annual cost because you're using so much less energy. But on top of that, the cost per unit energy of clean renewable energy is now lower than that of fossil fuels. So we estimate about a 63% or 62% reduction of annual energy costs by going to clean renewable energy in the UK. So that means going down from $228 billion per year energy costs to about $80 billion per year of energy costs, on top of eliminating the $140 billion per year health costs and the $260 billion per year climate costs, or sorry, $250 billion per year climate costs. So that's a 62% reduction in energy costs and about an 87% reduction in the total social cost of energy. And given that the upfront cost in the UK would be about $880 billion, that's about a 6-year payback time for energy costs and less than a 1-year payback time for total social costs. So this is a no-brainer. I mean, you can transition the energy, eliminate health and climate costs, reduce energy costs substantially, and create on top of that about 500,000 more long-term full-time jobs than lost. Use less than, on the order of 2% or less of the land area, because you're going to have offshore wind as well. So that's where some of these, have a lot of offshore wind turbines, for example. But the most, it'll be onshore wind, offshore wind, utility scale PV, rooftop PV. That'll be the dominant sources of energy. Plus, of course, battery storage, other types of storage, heat storage, cold storage. And we'll have imports of energy and exports of energy as well to balance the grid. So we've done simulations of balancing the grid in the UK as if it were an island. I mean, it is an island, but I mean an energy island, not connected to the rest of Europe. And we find we can keep the grid stable in isolation every 30 seconds for multiple years in the UK. But it's cheaper to interconnect. But the costs are not that different, but it is a little bit cheaper to interconnect. So we can keep the grid stable. We can keep the costs are much lower. Health benefits are much higher. Climate benefits are enormous. Jobs are created. We don't use a lot of land. We eliminate the fossil fuel infrastructure. We don't need it anymore for energy, that is. And this creates energy security as well, because these are all stable energy sources for a long time to come. Now, in terms of, do we need small modular reactors? It's not even an option. We need to solve 80% of the problem in 6 years, that's by 2030, and 100% by 2035 or soon after. New nuclear power, I mean, conventional nuclear reactors in Europe and the US, they do not take less than 17 years between planning and operation, and up to 21 years. And the cost is, like in the United States, only 2 reactors have been built in the last 20 years, at the same location in Vogtle, the Vogtle plant in Georgia, $35 billion for about 2.3 gigawatts. It's a little less than $16 a watt. New wind or solar is $1 a watt. And they don't compete on cost, and they take forever to build. You cannot plan, even if you plan today, they won't be ready till 2041, which is way too late. So it's not even an option, ignoring the risks associated with them, the energy security risks such as meltdown risk, weapons proliferation risk, underground uranium mining lung cancer risks, the radioactive waste storage risk, and the fact that they emit 9 to 37 times the carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour as wind when you look over the entire life cycle and account for their opportunity costs. Because while you're waiting around for those nuclear reactors to be built, you have coal and gas and bioenergy spewing out pollutants and greenhouse gases on the grid. So there's a huge emission associated with nuclear due to the delays, in addition to the fact that they emit direct heat, they emit water vapor, greenhouse gas, and then require energy to refine and mine uranium. So they're not zero emissions. Small modular reactors, they have similar problems. They're going to even be likely more expensive because you're using more materials for a smaller volume and other issues associated with them that I'm sure others will talk about. But they're already being, they were promised to be ready by 2027, then 2028, then 2029, then 2030, now 2031. So, and they're in the United States, the one small modular nuclear reactor company that was furthest along, they had an approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for design. They basically lost their main customers. The expenses went way too high. They're now delayed another several years till in the 2030s sometime. Their stock crashed. They were then sued for fraud, and so other problems associated with that type of that company, and also other similar companies just not even have designs approved. So we cannot rely on this technology when we know it will not be commercial before sometime in the 2030s, if ever. And that's when by 2030, we need 80% of the problem solved. We need to focus on what works, and that's clean renewable energy. In addition, you don't eliminate these other energy security problems with small modular reactors. In fact, they increase weapons proliferation risk because they are so modular. I mean, I saw this Department of Energy video where they're showing these reactors being shipped around on a truck. If you can ship around a nuclear reactor on a truck, what's to stop it from being trucked to some other country and that wants to develop a weapon secretly under the guise of civilian nuclear energy programs? So they don't necessarily reduce the risk of meltdowns because they're different design types. Those that can reduce the risk of and also that, well, they're those that reduce the risk of weapons proliferation because they have some other designs to try to reduce. Well, I mean, let me back up. There are so many issues that do not disappear with small modular nuclear reactors that we have with large reactors. So let me just stop there. I think I've taken up a lot of time already, but happy to answer questions. But the conclusion is that we have the ability to transition the UK to 100% clean renewable energy and storage for everything. The transition's already ongoing. The clear thing is to focus, deploy as fast as possible, and keep our eye on the ball. Do not get distracted by technologies that will not help us, such as new nuclear power, whether it's small or large. And this also goes for carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, which are basically constructs of the fossil fuel industry, and also this bioenergy, which is basically just increases air pollution, increases greenhouse gas emissions, and uses huge amounts of land. So with that, I'll stop and happy to answer questions at some point.
Okay, can we have some questions on the chat line, please? Questions on the chat line to Mark Jacobson. Alison, can you hang around for a couple of minutes? Did you say you have to be gone by 6:30? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm all right for a little while, Dave. No problem.
Okay, so questions to Mark Jacobson. Anybody got any questions? Like to give any? Anyway, well, I've got one. If nobody else has chucked in anything, how far do you think the IRA is getting? Now, to the British audience, that's a little scary because it stands for Irish Republican Army. But of course, in America, it's the Inflation Reduction Act, which has boosted various forms of energy. Well, I'll let you do a conclusion on that one, Mark.
Well, it's a mixed bag. So I would say 60% of the money in the Inflation Reduction Act is going to useful endeavors, such as wind, solar, battery storage, heat pumps, energy efficiency, electric induction cooktops, battery electric vehicles, and other types of storage. But 40% is really going to, these technologies are not helpful. So small modular nuclear reactors keeping existing nuclear reactors alive. Also carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, electrofuels, which relies on carbon capture and keeps fossil fuel, basically it's a replacement for fossil combustion fuels. And also bioenergy is getting money as well. So these are 40% is going to what I call useless technologies. So that's not helping at all, but 60% is going to useful technologies.
Right. So we've got Frank Bolton. You made a comment. The trade union movement in the UK sees renewables as a threat to jobs. I'm not sure they do. Not the ones I know. But anyway, I don't. But what's the attitude? How do you find trade unions react to what you're saying, Mark?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
How do you find somebody's just made a comment about some trade unions, the renewables as a threat to jobs. How have you found trade union attitudes to renewables?
Well, it's different. I mean, some places, like when we actually looked in New York in 2013, when trade unions were 100% behind transition of New York to 100% renewables, and that's in fact that helped. There's a law in New York to go to 100% renewables. In fact, 20 U.S. states and territories have laws, and many of these are supported by unions. Now, there's some unions that don't like renewables, but I'd say most of them do, because there are they create jobs. I mean, renewables increase the number of jobs in most places. I mean, the places where they're decreasing are really heavy fossil fuel producers. But worldwide, we calculate 28 million more long-term full-time jobs than lost. Certainly in the US, there's more jobs created than lost in the UK as well. So my experience is most trade unions like it. Not all trade unions like this, but most of them do.
Okay, fine. Another question from Ace Hoffman. How much nuclear waste per kilowatt will SMRs supposedly create compared to, say, Vogtle? That's a nuclear plant in the Georgia and USA. But yeah, that's a bit technical. My answer to that would be the smart answer: absolutely none, because we'll never have any. Anyway, have you got anything on that, Mark?
Yeah. So what I was trying to say, and I was fumbling my words before, was that there are different designs of small modular reactors being proposed, and some claim that they're going to have less waste. But the reason they have less waste is because they keep refining the uranium. They keep reusing the uranium and refining it to a higher degree. So that just increases the risk of weapons proliferation by creating closer to weapons grade uranium. So there's a trade-off. You can either create more weapons grade uranium and less waste, or you have more waste and less weapons grade uranium. So I think you lose in both situations.
Next from Nigel Doggett. What is the expected requirement for short and long-term storage, and how quickly does this need to be ramped up?
I mean, we have long-term storage today. I mean, batteries can be concatenated together in series, and you can have as long as storage as you want, or you can use them in parallel and you get high peaking rates, because you need storage for two purposes. One is for peaking and one is for long-term storage. Now, in fact, we just did a study that just published a study looking at, well, what's better, just using batteries for all storage, not all storage, but I mean with hydro. Well, first of all, every country has some hydro, so that's going to be in the background anyway. But should we use just hydro and batteries, or hydro and batteries and hydrogen fuel cells? Because the advantage of hydrogen fuel cells is, even though they're pretty expensive for peaking power, they're less expensive for long-term storage. So we found that batteries and hydro work everywhere, but adding some hydrogen fuel cells actually reduces the cost of storage in many places, not everywhere. Some places all you need is batteries and hydropower, but adding hydrogen fuel cells in some places with batteries can make it cheaper to keep the grid stable. So we found the simulations we've done for the UK and everywhere in the world, we look at long-term storage, and we do simulations every 30 seconds for multiple years, and we never found a place where we can't keep the grid stable with 100% renewables based on basic storage like batteries, hydropower, and now in this latest study adding fuel cells to that.
I've got a question here. It's a bit specific about the UK and SMRs on Teesside, and this claim that it's going to be privately funded. I'll leave that to Steve Thomas later, who might know something about that. But the next one from Peter Strachan. He says, "Hi, Mark. What do you see as the principal barrier to moving to 100% renewable future in the UK?"
Well, right now, I mean, we have so short of a time, and hi, Peter, thanks for the great question. The thing we have such a short time, we really need to focus on what works. So the problem we're having is there's so many competing energy technologies trying to get funding for, the available funding for a transition. So in the US, as I mentioned, we have the fossil fuel companies pushing carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, electrofuels. We have the bioenergy companies pushing, or the agricultural companies pushing bioenergy. That's biofuels, biogas, biomass. And we have the nuclear industry pushing small modular reactors, big reactors, and keeping existing reactors alive. So this, I think, is a really big barrier to having all this competition for limited funds when you have technologies that will not be available or just don't work or don't help, or maybe help a little bit with one problem but cause damage in the other problem. So it's our inability to focus and stick on topic and stay on and focus on what actually works and what can be implemented quickly. I think that is the main issue. And also, then people are also there's a misinformation campaign about renewables that still continues. So that's, one thing. I mean, there are some practical issues like, well, I don't know if it's so much of an issue in the UK, but getting transmission lines implemented in, for example, in the US, that takes a long time for just permitting purposes. It's not a technical or even economic issue. It's a permitting issue. And there is NIMBYism, nobody wants to build anything. Okay, so, but you have to pick something. So the question is, what is the least of all evils? And because nobody wants any energy technology, but would you rather have a nuclear power plant near you or a wind farm or a solar farm? I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to for a lot of people, in addition to what are the other impacts. So, there are barriers that do face us. But I think if we keep focus and keep our eye on the ball and really examine what are the benefits of such a transition, we see that the benefits are so great to just focus on clean renewable energy that, it just makes no sense from a social point of view, from a society point of view, from a country or a state's point of view. Why do anything else? This is what's working. This can be implemented. We can solve the problem this way. So I think that really has to be emphasized going forward.
A couple of people asking whether you've got a UK specific paper you can share for the UK figures. Perhaps you can send that on later.
Yeah. Well, I'll give this summary here. I can actually share this because what we did was there was one paper where we looked at Europe and all individual, trying to keep the grid stable in individual countries in Europe, and then joining them together in different configurations to see how that would change the cost of keeping the grid stable. So in that study, we actually did a nice UK in isolation, and this is the result I just put on the chat, but let me actually share the paper as well.
Right. So yeah, great. If you could do that. Yes.
Yeah, here's
we've got
the paper
Andrew.
comes from. But then a more recent paper on, because that was part of a few years ago, and then there's a more recent paper which includes the UK as part of the European grid, so it doesn't actually isolate UK. So the first paper isolates the UK, the second paper is more recent, but it has UK's combined with the rest of Europe. So there's a couple papers there.
Great. Eric says it is essential to use 100% renewables, but the existing inverters are making the grid less stable. We also need to add grid stability systems. So what do you say about inverters, etc.?
Well, I mean, first of all, batteries should help a lot to keep the grid stable. I mean, California now has about 8 or 9 gigawatts of batteries on the grid. They're 4-hour batteries. And just to put that in perspective, I mean, except for summer, the peak demand on the entire California grid is, somewhere between 25 and 30 gigawatts. So, we're close to a third of the peak power can be supplied by batteries for 4 hours. And there's, this is just in 3 years. And that's, I mean, amazing growth. And so I think, and we haven't had grid stability problem. There was like 2020, there were some blackouts, but that was nothing to do with the renewables on the grid. Had to do a few other things, but there hasn't been a blackout, and batteries respond so quickly, 10 to 20 milliseconds for a response to a drop in power. Whereas natural gas takes 5 minutes to get to 100% from zero power. So I mean, even the, combined, I mean, even open cycle gas turbines, which are used for peaking power, they take 5 minutes. Batteries take 10 to 20 milliseconds. So hydropower takes 15 seconds. This is why batteries are so good. I mean, they respond so quickly to a drop in anything on the grid, and so they can be used to regulate the grid quite well. So we haven't had this issue with that, or at least I'm not aware of this issue occurring where I live in California. But so I think that any of these things, if there a problem does arise, there are solutions. It just takes time to implement them sometimes, but it's not I don't think that's a technically difficult problem to solve.
We've got a couple of questions about nuclear bombs and nuclear weapons and SMRs and so on from Andrew Lohman and Nigel Doggett. Perhaps the connections between Rolls-Royce and SMRs can be, again, can I shuffle that one later to Steve Thomas, who's talked specifically about UK and SMRs. Sorry about that, but we're going to move on. Ibrahim Bornoba says, what transitional approach would advise regions like sub-Saharan Africa that relied on fossil fuels as sources of income in relation to their development? You've done a lot of international studies, Mark, haven't you?
Yeah, we've done for many countries in Africa. We've done studies for them, not all the countries, because we don't have data for every country, but most of them we have data for, and we have a plan. And in fact, so I can share, there's this link has actually all the individual plans. You can click on an individual plan for all the countries we have so far, at least. Well, that's actually, we have some updates to that, but they're just not yet published. So I don't actually have official numbers for those yet. But we find everywhere in Africa, yeah, we can get 100% renewables, keep the grid stable with resources in these countries. In the most recent study we did, we broke up Africa into 4 regions and looked at interconnecting those regions. And we found grid stability at low cost. I mean, each region has a different set of resources. I mean, each country has a different set of resources, but that's a nice thing with clean renewables. There are many sources. There's a combination of wind, solar, and wind is very complementary to solar, and then hydro is very good for backup. And that's going to, those are going to be the backbones of any clean renewable energy grid, and Africa is no exception.
Right, I'm just running through. I'm conscious of time here, so I'm running through the rest of the questions to try and look for stuff we haven't covered so much recently. This is a difficult question for you, Mark. Do you have a view on the German Darmstadt University iron-based energy storage project, Clean Circles?
Is this iron air batteries, or I'm not really sure what that is?
Yes, must be.
I mean, there are multiple types of batteries being proposed and trying to be commercialized, and anything that works is great. So, lower cost batteries that can be used for, there's different, you'll need for vehicles, you need very high density batteries, but for stationary electricity storage, where there's a huge demand for storage, we can afford to have bigger batteries that are less dense. So as long as they're low cost and can be implemented quickly, that's great. I'm supportive. I don't know, how far along that is, but a lot of different battery solutions I've heard of sound great. It's just a question of what the cost is.
I've got a question from Paul Dorfman. Given renewables will do heavy lifting for net zero, can nuclear economically, practically load follow?
No, well, there are only 2 countries in the world that even try to load follow with nuclear. It's France and Belgium, I believe, and they only load follow to the extent it's like, I mentioned open cycle gas turbines take 5 minutes to go to 100%. In those cases, I think there's like 20 to 100 minutes to go to 100%. So they can't, they can slowly, gradually follow load, but they can't meet short peaks in demand. I mean, you need batteries or hydro, or in the worst case, open cycle gas turbines to meet these short peaks in demand. So nuclear absolutely cannot do that. So they do need backup on top of that. But when they're running in this load following mode, then their capacity factors are much lower. So in France, you have low capacity factors of nuclear. In fact, a year ago, it was like 52%, not only because of, I mean, it's normally been low, but then it went lower because they're so old. All those reactors are so old. So there's a trade-off. If you want high capacity factors, you pretty much have to run them at base load. You can ramp up load following like they do, but still that doesn't meet peaks in the demand. And so they still require backup, just like other forms of energy do.
Okay, thanks. Well, you've given us nearly half an hour now. I'll run through most of the questions that haven't repeated themselves, at least. So perhaps, and I know Alison Downes has just got to make a beeline to talk to those European Commission officials. I just know, just waiting for her. So or whatever you're doing, Alison, I'm just joking there. And so perhaps we ought to go over to her. And thank you very much for that,
Yeah.
Mark. I know you've got a lot of pressure on your time. It's been really fantastic for you to join us. Thank you very much. So muted round of applause for you. Thanks. That's great. That's great.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, and now over to you, Alison. You're going to talk about Sizewell C, the great monster that awaits us at the end of some people's garden, at least.
I certainly am. Thank you, Dave. I don't want to disabuse you, though, and claim that I'm here for Sizewell. I'm actually here to talk about human rights issues to do with my old job. But thank you for it's nice to see everybody this evening. I'll just, obviously your focus is mainly on SMRs, but I just want to give you a sort of quick summary of where we're at with Sizewell. I actually want to start with Hinkley Point, which seems perhaps an odd place to start. But really my message this evening is to try and sort of debunk claims that EDF is making that somehow Sizewell is going to be an improvement on Hinkley, and that somehow the sort of learning from Hinkley Point will mean that Sizewell will be quicker and cheaper to build, because I think there's plenty of reasons why that isn't the case. I'm sure you're all familiar with the figures, but obviously in the last couple of weeks we've learned that the cost is up to 35 billion from 17 from 18 in 2015 money, 46 billion in today's money, and the delay is now between 4 and 6 years since construction began. Obviously, if we count the Christmas turkeys in 2017, we're talking a lot later than that. But really, you know, as we know, every EPR project has been late, between 6 and 14 years late, at least double the budget, where we know about what those costs are. And Hinkley is 5th and 6th of a kind of EPR, rather than the first of a kind that EDF is claiming. And these cost and schedule updates have been happening for a number of years now. You know, the first in 2017, just a year after construction began. And this strongly suggests that there was no learning from the 4 previous EPR projects. I mean, obviously, Olkiluoto in Finland was 14 years late. Flamanville in France is not due online till later in 2024, and it's at least 12 years behind schedule and 4 times over budget. But it's interesting to note, and Steve Thomas reminded me that this was the case, that the cost of one reactor at Flamanville may have escalated to 11.2 billion in 2015 money, but that's still 11.2 billion for a single reactor, whereas Hinkley's likely to cost 17.5 billion pounds for a single reactor. So, you know, on that basis, replication seems to increase cost rather than reduce it. So, you know, these sort of failures, you know, are very indicative of a much wider problem. And really, you know, the most logical conclusion is that it's the technology to blame, you know, not just poor execution of these projects, although I'm sure that's played a part. And again, I'm sure those on the call will be very familiar with the words of former EDF CEO Henry Poglio, who told the French Assembly last Christmas that the EPR is too complicated, almost unbuildable. And really no amount of replication is going to change a complex technology into a simple technology. And as we know, France is not going to build any more of this type of reactor in their country, but proposes to construct 6 of the simpler EPR2 reactors, which EDF described as simplification and optimization of the design of the EPR. So the only cost that is Taishan, which itself was late and was twice the budget. And the problems at Taishan are sort of broader than just their delivery, because Taishan 1 has been off for the best part of 2 years with fuel failure related problems, which the French regulator has prompted the French regulator to call for design changes to be implemented in Flamanville at some stage. Really, when we come to Sizewell, the only cost that's in the public domain is this £20 billion, and which is so out of date. And it's quite extraordinary that the night before the Hinkley Point announcement update was made, which ministers clearly knew about it because they said things to us which jolly well showed that they knew Hinkley was going to be considerably delayed. They chose to put double the taxpayers' investment in Sizewell C, so it's now up to £2.5 billion. And along with the £1 billion that EDF has already spent, you know, this must make it the most expensive nuclear project to have not yet reached a final investment decision in the history of the industry. It's quite extraordinary. And also, just a little anecdote, I don't know who thought it was a good idea for Andrew Bowie, the minister in the centre, to use the same spade that David Cameron had used to break ground at Hinkley Point in 2013. But as omens go, I mean, it must be a fiasco, really, because obviously Hinkley is a dreadful role model. And furthermore, it took another 3 years from David Cameron wielding this same spade for Hinkley to reach a final investment decision. So let's hope it's 3 years for Sizewell, if not never, which would be our preference, clearly. But just in terms of this kind of replication argument, it doesn't matter who pays for Sizewell C. EDF are the people who would have to build and supply it. And there is this legitimate question with EDF sort of wanting, France wanting EDF rather to concentrate on domestic priorities, whether the company would become very overstretched. And skills-wise, there is a problem as well, because the original intention was to limit the gap between Hinkley and Sizewell to about 2 years, so that workers that finished one stage of the Hinkley project could then move on to Sizewell and begin the same stage of work there. And that gap's now about 8 years. So it's understandable that EDF would want to use the Hinkley work to try and sort of de-risk the project, but that's no use if those workers have had to go off and find jobs elsewhere and are not available. So the solitary silver lining with the Hinkley C project is, as the government points out, that the overruns and overspends are the responsibility of EDF. But this presents the government with something of a problem, because the intention to use the regulated asset-based model at Sizewell C means that when that project overran and overspent, as it inevitably will, the responsibility is going to be on taxpayers and on consumers. So I think another key sort of reason to debunk this claim that somehow Sizewell will be easier and quicker and cheaper to build than Hinkley Point is that you can't replicate the project location. It's not a case of taking Hinkley Point and just dumping it at Sizewell. And it's been described by an ONR official as an expensive site to develop. And the same person also said that any savings the project might make with above-ground replication were likely to be completely absorbed by difficult groundworks. So, you know, it is a complex site. It's more and more constrained. It's got protected habitats all around it. It's in a water-stressed area. It's right next to the Minsmere Nature Reserve, and it also is on one of the fastest eroding coastlines in the UK. So Sir David King, for example, said that Sizewell would be very difficult to prevent from flooding, and there have been huge controversies around the significant coastal defences that would be needed. So in terms of sort of thinking of what, quick map of how Sizewell might be an island in the future, taken from official sources. So just assume of the, in terms of the impact of implications of all of this from consumers, as I pointed out, it would be consumers through the tariff that would pay if Sizewell C were to cost more than that was predicted and to overrun. We'd be paying during construction anyway. We'd just be paying longer and more money, depending on what the schedule for Sizewell C was. And we were pleased to see that Citizens Advice published a robust response to the government's consultation recently, saying that consumers need to be protected from this risk. And the UK Science and Information Technology Committee, Innovation and Technology Committee also said that a headline cost lower than Hinkley Point's not justified if the risk is too great. So all of this also has, policy implications. The Labour Party want to decarbonise the power system by 2030. For the current government, it's 2035. Sizewell is not going to help either of those two policy objectives. So, an electricity system has to be developed that is going to lead to a decarbonised grid by those dates. And it's just inconceivable that whatever is put in place could not be scaled up rather than this extraordinary investment that will be required in Sizewell C. And I think what is really important to note in the context of what Mark's just been saying about battery storage is that the government is relying for its full business case for Sizewell C on a power sector model that is incapable of modelling long-term storage. So the government does have a new model. It is being introduced at the moment, and they do plan to rerun their 2050 net zero modelling in a year or two. But why make a final investment decision on a hugely expensive project like Sizewell if in a year or two you're going to redo the modelling and find that you don't need it? So as Mark has pointed out, the speed of delivery, the cost of electricity is going to be more expensive than would be otherwise available. Potentially Sizewell would increase rather than reduce system costs. And there are also all the non-monetised benefits, so-called benefits that the government has to assess when it's looking at a project like this. So, for example, the number of jobs that would be available locally is minuscule comparison to jobs that would be available in other strategies like energy efficiency. So, I think there's an awful lot more I could say, as you'll appreciate, but I think given the sort of general focus this evening on SMRs, I probably would be best to leave it there to allow time for questions before we go on to hear from Steve.
Okay, great. So have we got any questions for Alison? Any questions? You were quite quick off the mark asking for questions there. So for a little taster, how about who's going to pay for all the cost overruns of Sizewell C then, which will inevitably occur?
Well, we don't know what the risk sharing allocation is being proposed for Sizewell C. What's definite is that consumers will pay during the construction of Sizewell C, whether it overruns or not. That's a given, because this funding model that is being proposed would give any external investors, and we don't know if there is anybody that's really interested, but there few seem to be sniffing around an immediate return. And if there are cost overruns, then it seems very likely that at least a percentage of those will be passed on to consumers. There's nothing in the proposed modifications of Sizewell C's generating license that says that the consumers will be completely protected from any overruns at all.
Right, and Paul Dorfman has asked, the French government won't touch the current design of the European pressurized reactor known as EPR1 for their new nuclear power stations that they are planning whenever they happen. Does that imply something for the UK's current EPR designs that have been approved by the regulatory system?
Well, obviously, the general design assessment for the EPR was given by the Office for Nuclear Regulation. Steve will remember the exact date for that. But I think it just suggests that the UK is being taken for fools to, continue to plug away with a technology that is so obviously riddled with difficulties. I mean, it's also telling that officials, when they talk about the civil nuclear roadmap, have made it clear that they are going to look at a 3rd gigawatt project. I mean, it's a very sort of sketchy commitment that they're making to just explore another gigawatt project. But they've made it clear that they'll be looking beyond EDF and the EPR. Well, you know, that suggests they've had their fill of learning. But why they would then continue to back Sizewell C when they can clearly appreciate that, you know, Hinkley is an absolute fiasco is just beyond us. And it, you know, the French government are now trying to get the UK to help stump up to finish Hinkley, and I think this is sort of punishment because it was the UK's insistent that China was booted out of Sizewell and decided to flounce off in a huff after putting in its contractually agreed amount at Hinkley Point C. But, you know, maybe this is an elaborate ploy to get out of Sizewell C because, you know, they do really want EDF to sort of go back home and get their own house in order. But it's all very murky, and, you know, I'm afraid we don't know exactly what's going on behind closed doors.
Yeah, I hope it's an elaborate ploy myself. And I've got a question from Guy Nicholson. What's the role of Ofgem, who are supposed to protect consumers from high costs in the Sizewell RAB saga?
Well, if Guy's interested, and I've got his email, I can send him some Ofgem guidance on how they think they would manage the Sizewell generation license. It's certainly more accessible than the government's own consultation documents on the modifications. There are all sorts of incentives that are supposed to keep Sizewell in check. You know, they're supposed to sort of, you know, get penalties if they mismanage the project. But since the ultimate motivation to finish a project on time and on budget is if it's coming out of your own pocket, hasn't worked at Hinkley, it's impossible to see how any kind of structure where you get paid, you know, even if you're not doing brilliantly, will have an effect. So, yeah, I can't see any evidence that RAB is going to somehow make EDF's ability to deliver Sizewell C much more effective.
Pete Roach wants a little clarification. Did you say the government model can't model any storage or just long-term storage?
So the dynamic dispatch model, which is the power sector model that the department currently uses, cannot model storage that is greater than 24 hours duration.
Righty-ho. By the way, for those uninitiated or in America, for instance, RAB means regulated acid base. And it was used in a slightly different form for the disastrous building of Plant Vogel in Georgia and also the abandoned scheme in South Carolina, but with a different twist in the UK, in, of course, that instead of the consumers stumping up for all the money as the plant is built, the consumers just pay for the interest and profits on equity, the shares, whereas magically, somehow all the money that's borrowed to build the project somehow floats away somewhere. Of course, the consumers, I say, are going to have to pay for this in the long run, big time as well. Anyway, that's me saying this. But perhaps, if there's no more questions, Alison, that's been really great. I haven't got any more questions that I can see at the moment, apart from ones I've probably missed. So thank you for that.
No, I do apologise that I've got to leave as well, but thank you very much for inviting me.
That's great. Thank you very much, Alison. You've shone a lot of light on a tricky subject. And right on time, actually. I told Steve Thomas you'll be on at 6:30, and it is now almost 6:30. So one of those rare occurrences where my planning has proved to be correct. By accident, probably. So here we have Professor Stephen Thomas from Greenwich University talking to us from Brighton, as it happens. who is going to be talking about small modular reactors. He's done quite a lot of academic research and public dissemination on this, including a report to the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee, which they may or may not have read to a greater or lesser extent. Anyway, Stephen, you have control over your presentation, which is, you say, longer, so I'll try and circulate it later. But anyway, over to you, Stephen. You're still muted, Stephen.
No, I'm not.
All right.
I don't think so. I'm just trying to share my screen. And there it goes. Great. Right. All of you will be aware of the vast amount of publicity that is being put out for small modular reactors, and some very extravagant claims are being made for them. They're cheaper and easier to build, less prone to cost and time overruns. They're easier to finance. They're safer. Some are called meltdown proof, walkaway safe. They produce less waste. And because they're smaller, they'll be easier to site, and they'll create large numbers of new jobs. I mean, a lot of these claims are down to the very poor quality of the media, which reports pious hopes of the nuclear industry as if they were facts. They say SMRs will be cheaper and are cheaper and easier to build, but we haven't built any yet. So how on earth do they know that? But anyway, as a result of this, there is a widespread impression that there are large numbers of SMR orders being placed and are being constructed all around the world. And these claims are just wrong. At best, they're unproven, they're misleading. There are no modern SMR designs operating. There are 3 under construction: China, Russia, and India, so of no relevance to us whatsoever. No current design has completed a full safety review by an experienced and credible regulator. And until that's been done, until you know what the regulator is asking for, you don't know what the costs are going to be. So no SMRs are available to order now, even if you wanted to. So what are they? Well, the term SMR covers such a wide range of sizes and technology as to be essentially meaningless. The conventional definition of an SMR is that they are reactors between 30 and 300 megawatts. There is a smaller class of reactors up to 30 megawatts, which are generally called microreactors. To try and make a bit more sense of them, you can divide them into 2 different categories. One category is are smaller versions of the type that are the main reactor designs operating in the world. So these are pressurized water reactors like Sizewell B, Hinkley Point C, and boiling water reactors, BWRs. We haven't built any in the UK yet, but they were proposed for Wildver and Oldbury, but those proposals collapsed. The second category is advanced, what the UK calls advanced modular reactors. These are not new technologies. They're technologies that have been around for 50 or more years. In some cases, they have been built as prototypes or demonstration reactors. For example, sodium fast breeder reactors like the Dounreay reactor on the north coast of Scotland. All of these prototypes and demonstration plants were unsuccessful. Some of them are reactor designs that have been talked about for a long, long time, but never built. So we have things like the molten salt reactor, lead-cooled fast reactors. There was an organization called the Generation 4 Forum set up to promote these advanced modular reactors in 2001, 2002. When they were set up, they said these would be commercially available by around 2025. Their latest projection is they will be commercially available around 2050 at the earliest. So in terms of climate change, they are just an irrelevance. The UK is pursuing just one particular type of advanced modular reactor, the high temperature gas-cooled reactor, because of the hope that they can be forced to operate at up to 900 degrees centigrade, which opens the way for them to be used to allow the efficient production of hydrogen by a thermochemical process. It seems it will be a stretch to make them work at that level. And in fact, the British government itself says they're not very likely. BEIS are not currently aware of any viable, fully commercial proposals for HTRs that can be deployed in time to make an impact on net zero by 2050. Then they say, basically, we're going to put money into the British reactor design industry, and that will solve things. Well, if you're relying on the British reactor design industry, whose last reactor design was the advanced gas-cooled reactor about 60 years ago, then you really are desperate. So let's move on to the designs that are at least plausible. We know that PWRs and BWRs do work to the extent that they generate electricity. Although the definition is 30 to 300 megawatts, they are all much bigger than that. There is one design that is 77 megawatts, the one that Mark talked about in the United States. They're just about to go bankrupt. All the rest are 300 megawatts or more. If you read the publicity about SMRs, you will think that they are small bits of kit that an IKEA lorry will deliver and bolt down on the edge of an old site. The Rolls-Royce design is 470 megawatts. It's talked about as being a possibility for the Transvanith site. 470 megawatts would make it twice the size of the Transvanith reactors, about the same size as an AGR. So Rolls-Royce SMRs are smaller than EPRs, but they are not small by any other criteria. There is also talk about the improvements in the designs. And again, the press is guilty here for assuming that a feature in one design occurs in all designs. So some designs claim improved safety by passive safety. And what passive safety means is that instead of relying on, for example, an emergency core cooling system to kick into action when you've got a meltdown, natural process like natural convection will cool the plant down. Others talk about the reactor being integral, and what that means is that instead of just the reactor being in the reactor vessel, all the major systems are contained in the reactor vessel, and it is assumed that because they are in that much stronger vessel, they're much safer. Some reactors are proposed to be built underground and built underwater, and again you can see that this might have some safety features. The Rolls-Royce SMR has none of these features. It's just an old school pressurized water reactor, just like Sizewell B, only smaller. In October, the mythical Great British Nuclear selected 6 designs which could bid for money, for government money, to develop those designs. So that was Rolls-Royce, GE Hitachi, Holtec, Westinghouse, Framatome, and NuScale. Rolls-Royce's design is already undergoing review by the Office of Nuclear Regulation. GE Hitachi and Holtec have just been given 30 million quid of public money each to start a review by the ONR. Westinghouse has just applied for that process for its reactor. The results of this contest will come out in spring of this year. The contract's in the summer. We don't know what the amount of money available is. All the government documents say there's a budget up to 20 billion to be spent by the mid-30s to design and build SMRs, so that they're telling us nothing. So let's look at the claims for them, and the biggest claim is on scale, that they are smaller, therefore they'll be cheaper, which is contradictory. SMRs, the original reactors were SMRs, or small reactors. They were reactors like Bradwell and Berkeley were about 140 megawatts, Calder Hall and Chapel Cross about 60 megawatts. The size of reactor has increased consistently since the 1960s, and it's to pursue scale economies because the economics of the existing reactors were so poor. And you can easily see what those scale economies might be. A 1,000 megawatt reactor vessel weighs less and costs less than 5 200 megawatt reactor vessels. So those scale economies clearly exist. The problem is that they have never been observable because other cost factors seem to be going up much faster than the scale economies were bringing them down. And you would guess probably that it's the additional safety features that have been necessary because the reactors weren't as safe as we thought they were. So the other big claim from SMRs is that they will be largely manufactured in factories. They'll be loaded on the back of a lorry and bolted together on site, so that instead of all the site work that we see at places like Hinckley and Sizewell, it would happen in the much more controlled environment of a factory. But of course, if there are savings, they will have to counter those lost scale economies. And the question that's never answered is, why are reactors so difficult to build? Is it because they're large, or is it actually because they're more complex than they used to be? Why would a small reactor be any less complex than a large one, unless you're going to take things off it? Are you going to take away some of the safety systems that a large reactor would need? And of course, the nuclear industry is having its own little argument about whether large reactors are cheaper than small reactors, but actually that's not what it's about. It's about whether they're the cheapest option, low carbon option. And very clearly, they are massively more expensive than renewables such as offshore wind, onshore wind, even solar in the UK. Very interesting case is the history of the Westinghouse AP designs. You'll know, some of you will remember that the Westinghouse AP 1000 was proposed for the Moorside site in just on the edge of the Sellafield site. That proposal collapsed when Westinghouse went bankrupt in 2017. But the history is that the AP 1000 came from a previous design, the AP 600. And when Westinghouse announced it, they said they'd look for scale economies and larger reactors, but there were none. So it sent it to the US Nuclear Regulatory Committee for approval. And after 5 years, that approval was given. But by then it was clear that it was uneconomic. So the Westinghouse never tried to sell the reactor. What they did was to scale it up to 1170 megawatts, the AP 1000, to improve the economics. They said, look, it's just a scaling up. So regulatory approval will take no time at all. They submitted it to the US regulator in 2002, and it took another 9 years to get regulatory approval. So scaling up and down is not a trivial process as far as a regulator is concerned. China built 4 of the AP1000s, decided they were too expensive, so it scaled it up again to 1,550 megawatts, so about the size of an EPR. Now, Westinghouse has scaled it down to 300 megawatts. This design was only announced in May 2023, so it's at a very early stage yet. So we have this contradiction that whenever a design proves to be uneconomic, Westinghouse either scales it up or scales it down. It claims whatever it does, it claims it's going to reduce costs. One of the features of the AP series was that it was supposed to be factory built, that it was modular, and it had passive safety, all the big design features that are supposed to make SMRs attractive. And I think the best you can say about the record of the AP1000 is that it may be marginally better than the EPR, but probably not very much. So what about production lines, factory manufacture, and so on, modular building? And production lines, you're supposed to get the image of a Model T Ford with vehicles moving slowly down the production lines, several hundred per day. And that's misleading because the Rolls-Royce production line would produce between 2 and 4 reactors per year. And that's not really what I recognize a production line. The logic of production lines is clear, that you set up some machinery, standard machinery that does the same repetitive job again and again. They're expensive to set up and they're inflexible. And they're only cheap if you can fully load them, so you can spread out those extra costs of setting them up. If you haven't got a flow of orders, and this is important for the British case, then you need to close them down and mothball. If the design needs to be changed, then you've got to retool the whole process. Rolls-Royce wants to make its first reactor on a production line to prove the economics. You can understand that, because if the economics are good because they're made on a production line. If you don't make them on a production line, you don't prove anything. But once you've got a production line, you've got to keep it fed. And if the production line is producing only 2 reactors per year, if the reactor takes 6 years to build, then you're going to have 12 reactors in various stages of construction before first kilowatt hour of electricity is generated. So before you know what the costs are, before you know if it'll even work reliably. So Rolls-Royce is asking for guarantees of orders for something like 12 or 15 reactors before it will go forward. You can understand that, but it's a huge gamble of public money to place orders for perhaps 15 reactors, 30 billion pounds worth of equipment before you know it would work, before you know it's technically viable. All reactors require a mixture of factory work and on-site assembly. The claim for SMRs is simply that the balance is a bit more towards off-site work. You're still going to have to dig holes in the ground. You're still going to have to pour concrete. You're still going to have to weld steel. The difference is just in emphasis. So what about the other claims? Waste. Well, all things being equal, a large PWR, BWR will create less waste than the same capacity of small reactors. Alison McFarlane, the former Nuclear Regulatory Commission commissioner, claimed that SMRs will increase the volume and complexity of waste by a factor of between 2 and 20. And if you think about a reactor vessel with a radioactive material in it, the smaller the vessel, the more it's going to get radiated. So it's going to produce more radiation. In terms of safety, well, each design has its own safety features, but if we look at the main features, passive safety, integral designs, subsurface designs. They're not necessarily safer, they just produce different safety issues. The big unanswered question, and the one that will only be answered when the regulatory bodies complete their reviews of the designs, is, are the small reactors going to be allowed to get away with fewer safety features than large ones? And until we know the detail of reactor designs like the Rolls-Royce, then we won't know if they're trying to get away without, say, a core catcher to stop a meltdown going into the earth, aircraft protection, which will protect it if an aircraft is flown into it. What about jobs? People talk about jobs, and EDF talked about 25,000 jobs being created at Hinkley Point C. This is very misleading. What they meant was that there would be 25,000 people working on the site over its construction period, typically for a year at a time. So this is not 25,000 jobs. This is 25,000 people working there for about a year. They have typically specific skills, not going to be found locally. So these are going to have to come from other parts of the country, or more likely even from abroad. And they're going to be very short term, very disruptive. And you'll find, as is happening at Hinkley Point, that holiday camps and hotels are being taken over to accommodate the workers. Of course, if SMRs are actually cheaper and easier and quicker to build than large reactors, they actually create fewer jobs and over a shorter period. You know, the more money you spend, the more jobs you create. So Hinkley Point C is a great job creator because it's going on so long and so much money is being spent. If factories with production lines are efficient, they'll need fewer workers than on-site assembly. And if we import the designs, we're not going to get those factories. If GE Hitachi exports reactors to the UK, those factories are going to be in Japan or the United States. So there'll be no jobs. Of course, once you get to the operating phase, that's relatively few permanent staff, probably in hundreds. Maybe there'll be a few more if you have 3 reactors rather than 1. But again, you're not going to be creating work for the local population. So, final slide, what are the conclusions? Well, SMR development is reliant on public money. In the past, you could rely on utilities building nuclear power plants. Now they have no interest in building nuclear capacity because if things go wrong, it's their shareholders will pay, not their consumers. Reactor vendors always overstate how close to availability their designs are. And if you look at publicity from Westinghouse, you would think they were ready to start building tomorrow. They're not going to be ready to build until a comprehensive safety review has been done. And that will be, in the case of Rolls-Royce, that will be more than 2 years away. In case of the other reactors in the UK, 4 or 5 years ago. Producing new reactor designs is risky and expensive, and it takes a long time. Mark talked about the new scale design. This is the 77 megawatt design that was going to be built in the USA. It took 20 years to get to that stage, and about £1 billion of money, including large amounts of US public money. So vendors are not going to be investing their own money. If we're going forward with SMRs, it will be public money and guarantees of orders that will bring them to the market. Who's going to produce those designs? Well, there's actually 2 different categories. There's the traditional vendors, the vendors that have produced the reactors we have, like Westinghouse, Framatome, GE Hitachi. They are small companies. Westinghouse and Framatome went bankrupt about 7 or 8 years ago. So they don't have the money to develop new designs. The cheap way for them to do it is to scale down their failed large designs. So the Westinghouse design AP1300 is a scaled down AP1000. The GE Hitachi BWRX300 is a scaled down ESBWR, a 1500 megawatt reactor. So uneconomic, it was never offered for sale. These were uneconomic, so why would scaling them down make them any better? The new companies lack credibility. Companies like Toke and X-Energy and all the other small companies that appear to be coming forward don't need public funding. They are small companies, they have no resources, and they have no credibility because they've never built a nuclear power station. So they will need to team up with someone with that credibility if they're going to sell reactors. I've probably overrun. I'm sorry if I have, but I hope that was useful. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Steve. Yes, well, that was extremely useful. I like your quote. When you say the cheap way to produce SMRs by these long-established but bankrupted companies is to scale down their failed designs. Yes, that just about says it all. And they'll actually produce more nuclear waste. Well, I didn't realize that, but well, can't be a plus, can it? And people have been asking questions about that in the past, so there's an answer to that. And you've also answered some previous questions about private and public money. It's going to be public money. I don't know where these people come from with their stuff. This is going to be built on private money. Well, anyway, there we are. So, but there's a couple of other questions later on that people have asked. Veets from South Africa says, according to the local South African protagonist, Dr. Kem, the pebbles, he's talking about pebble reactors. He's asking about that. Could you say something about the feasibility of the South African pebble bed reactors in SMR guys? Apparently all ready to be up and running in 5 or 6 years. Are they just, well, I'll add in my own pennyworth, are they just scaled down versions of already failed designs? So according to the South African protagonist, Dr. Kem, the pebbles get fed in one end and the spent pebbles come out the other. And the whole reaction is under full control during the whole cycle of pebbles going in and coming out. So can you enlighten us more on that one, Steve?
Yes, I mean, it's a useful and interesting example because the design that's most likely to be pursued in the UK, if high temperature gas cooled reactors are pursued, is very similar to the design that was pursued in South Africa, the pebble bed modular reactor. The history of that is that from 1987 onwards, the South African nuclear industry had taken a German design, which they licensed, and they tried to turn it into a South African design, which would be economic and would win markets all around the world. After more than 20 years, they finally abandoned the whole process in 2010 after more than 20 years, they still didn't have a design. They had no customers. The whole thing was a public spending disaster. In terms of the design, I mean, I know of Kelvin Kem. He talks about feeding in the pebbles at the top of the reactor and then taking them out at the bottom. The problem is that when this was tried in Germany with the prototype reactor, and they tried to operate it at 900 degrees C, the pebbles stuck, and instead of gradually working their way down the column in which they're housed, they stuck and they overheated. And the best guess is that they hit around 1500 degrees C which meant that the fuel started to disintegrate. The reactor is now closed, and it's full of radioactive fuel dust and radioactive graphite dust, and it's a horrendous mess. So, you know, that I think the South African experiment is going nowhere. They put more than 20 years of public money in it, got nowhere. Kelvin Chem will never give up on it, but it's dead in the water.
You're muted, Dave.
Thank you for somebody pointing that out. For noticing that my mouth was moving, right? Without any sound going out. Anyway, Veach says, we expect renewables to cost about 20% of today's real cost in a decade. How are SMRs going to be a similar cost by then? Well, they're not. I can answer that one. Going on to next one, Marku says, many nuclear advocates argue that overregulation has made SMRs and nuclear in general economically unviable. Efforts are underway to streamline and internationally harmonize safety regulation. Any views on these claims and national and international streamlining efforts, Steve?
I feel like I'm in a time warp with this, that what I was hearing 50 years ago, that what we needed was to bring on the new designs because they'd solve all the old problems. We need to streamline planning, and we need to streamline regulation, and we need to cut tape. It's never worked in the past, so I can't for the life of me think why it would work now. And given the history of nuclear power with a significant number of major accidents like 3 Mile Island, like Chernobyl, like Fukushima, and like now the Ukrainian reactors, which fortunately have not led to an accident. But these were all events that the regulatory bodies did not anticipate as being feasible. Have we finally gone through all the sequences of events that could lead to serious accidents? I think it would be very optimistic to think that. I think all experience says we need to make regulation a bit more rigorous, not less rigorous. I mean, the regulatory bodies have always been a favorite Aunt Sally of the nuclear industry to blame all their ills on. You will probably have seen that EDF tried to blame the regulator for the cost and time overruns at Hinkley Point C, saying they needed masses more concrete and steel than was needed in France. And for once, the British regulator moved quickly and said, nope, we don't recognize those at all. That is just not true. So I think, you know, looking for regulation to as the source of the problems is just wrong.
Thank you for that. We've got Guy Nicholson asking, hi, Steve, were SMRs originally like submarine reactors and at that scale?
No, they're not like submarine reactors. I mean, people get that impression because of Rolls-Royce's history in supplying reactors. But, you know, a reactor that will fit in a nuclear submarine has very different design criteria to one that has as much space as it needs on a land site. So I think there is no, they are very different beasts. I mean, the submarine reactors require quite highly enriched uranium. They have to be very compact and so on. They are very different beasts.
We've got questions about the allegedly to be built with privately funded money, the Teesside SMR, and have you any view on the role of community nuclear power, which is mentioned in connection with the deal Westinghouse has supposedly struck? I'm trying to stop myself from laughing here, but anyway, sorry, carry on. Yes.
No, you're right. It appears to be a laughable announcement. They have no site. They have no contract to sell the power. They have no regulatory approval for the design. The Westinghouse has applied to the government for it to undergo generic design assessment. Government assesses that request, takes about a year. The regulator then carries out the generic design assessment. This has never taken less than 4 years. So we're looking at about 2030 before the design is in a state where it could be ordered and built. So I think there must be something more to it than there is on the face of it. Community Nuclear Projects is a shell company. It was created about 18 months ago with capital of £100. It appears to have no staff. It just has 3 directors. So I think I can only think of conspiracies here, really. Westinghouse is clearly very happy with the publicity it's getting because it knows that lazy journalists around the world will report this as Britain placing firm orders for 3 AP300s. As for Community Nuclear Project, maybe they think they can take this proposal to a certain level and then they can sell it to the government because they don't have the capability to carry through this project. A shell company is not going to be licensed to build and operate a nuclear power plant. So I think it's frankly just a laughable proposal, and I think it will disappear.
Thank you. Andrew Lohman says, what is the payback energy in to energy out? I think it used to be less than 1 now, 1 to 10. That's not exactly your field, Stephen, but I don't know if you've got anything on that.
I think nuclear power plants clearly are net producers of electricity. I think if you go back a very long way, and Dave Elliott might remember this, that some research at the Open University suggested that the French nuclear power program would be building so many reactors at the same time, using electricity to make the concrete and the steel, that actually more electricity would be used building those reactors than the 1 or 2 reactors that were actually operating. I don't think there is any risk that nuclear power plants won't be net generators. Of course, if you start to use very poor quality uranium, then much more energy is going to have to go into mining that uranium, processing it and making it into fuel. But I think we are not at that stage yet.
Okay, thank you very much. I haven't got any further questions on the chat line, but I don't know if anybody, if Stephen would like to add anything else as a final conclusion before I do the ultimate wrap up.
No, I don't think so. I think the next thing to watch out for is this announcement of the competition for British taxpayer money to subsidize the development of these 6 reactors that Great British Nuclear has selected. How much money is that going to be? I think going back to Alison's presentation, the target is 24 gigawatts by 2050, and that means 7 more big projects after Sizewell C. There aren't any other projects, so they can't allow Sizewell C to go down, and SMRs may be the best bet for follow-on stations, because the large reactor designs just simply aren't credible anymore.
Well, that certainly looks like a story of a sinking nuclear ship if the best they can come up with is the SMRs, is my completely unbiased comment. And I think that concludes today's session, which has, of course, been much more balanced than the Environmental Audit Committee's considerations of SMRs and 100% renewable energy, since they didn't have anything on 100% renewable energy, which we want to have. And I refer you to our petition page, where we're still open for a few signatures before we send it off to the Environmental Audit Committee and try and lobby individual members to have a good inquiry into the feasibility of 100% renewable energy. So thanks to you, Stephen, for coming along and presenting your very clear presentation. And of course, thanks to earlier contributions from Mark Jacobson and Alison Downes. So as people are saying, thank you very much. And I'll try and get this recording put on the web when I've got rid of all the times that I was speaking without any sound. Probably exceeded the clarity of some of the times I have been speaking with sound, to be honest, but there we are with that thought. Thank you all for coming, and good night.